Well, the 8th of March indeed marks International Women's Day. And women are the cornerstone of African economic development. Some estimate they provide around 70% of agricultural labor and produce around 90% of the continent's food. However, women are predominantly employed in the informal sector, or they occupy low-skilled jobs. Women may produce most of the food in Africa, but when it comes to employment in the non-agricultural sectors, they score lowest in the world at only 8.5%. The reason for that is insufficient access to key resources such as education and health. Inequalities based on social norms are also considered a factor. Well, let's get you some perspective on that now. I'm joined live in our Nairobi studios by Lillian Nyandoro. She's a Kenyan lawyer and secretary of the National Women's Steering Committee. Good evening, Lillian, and thank you for joining us on Africa Live. Well, indeed, you find organizations or institutions like the African Union routinely place gender equality, women's rights at the top of their annual agenda, and yet somehow that does not translate to what is happening on the ground. How would you explain that?
Okay, the challenge that we're having in Africa, we have very progressive laws and policy, but the challenge that is there is implementation. When it comes to implementation, there's a problem because there's no political cost in changing women. And then secondly, participatory, women do not participate in decision making. When you look at the structures, when those policies and those institutions are putting down those policies, you find that there are very few women in in those positions. So it affects, when women don't participate, it also affects in terms of implementation. So it's important that most countries come out and engage women so that they're part of the process of putting those issues of policies, encouraging them to participate. Then it will be easy at the institutional level when the policies are there, also at the implementation at the grassroots level, women can relate to those issues. So that's where the challenge is. There's a disconnect between the policymakers, the duty bearers, and also the women at the grassroots. Yes. And
having pointed to implementation as a challenge, and having said that it is a significant challenge, there are some countries that have gotten it right. And perhaps maybe you could name one that stands out as an example for the rest of the continent.
I was actually pleased to visit Rwanda. We went there for an educational tour. We are amazed that they're leading in the country, in the whole continent. The women in leadership, that's 64%. So we wanted to find out what's the magic, you know. And actually the difference that we found out is that they implement the law, you know, to the letter. Kenya, for example, we have very progressive constitution that talks about that in every appointive and elective position, we must adhere to the two-thirds gender principle. But when it comes to implementation, we are now heading towards election, but the issue of two-thirds is one of the legislations that have not been implemented. So we are not valued. We feel like as women, we are not valued, you know, in terms of implementation of this law. But Rwanda, one thing I like about it, when they say a third of elective position must be women, they actually ensure that they are women. So implementation of the law is key. You know, we set out rules, we should learn to abide by those rules.
Indeed.
Yes, yes.
All right, well, thank you so much, Lillian Nyandoro. Let's hope that other countries follow suit and practice what they preach.
Yes,
Lillian Nyandoro joining us here in our studios in Nairobi.